very creepy mobile shop horror stories. Lucas ran a modest mobile repair shop, a small business nestled at the edge of town. By day, it was a haven for customers seeking quick fixes, but by night, it became a lonely, almost haunting place. The flickering neon "Open 24 hours" sign buzzed faintly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance on their own. It was one of those nights. Quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world has forgotten you exist. Lucas was alone, tinkering with a broken phone, the rhythmic tick of the clock above the counter his only companion. The time read 2:34 a.m. He sighed deeply, debating whether to shut the shop early. The streets outside were deserted, cloaked in a dense, almost unnatural fog. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building. Just as Lucas moved to flip the sign to "Closed," the shop's door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, the bell above it jingling faintly. He froze. "Hello?" His voice wavered, barely above a whisper. A figure stepped inside, tall and cloaked in an oversized coat. The hood was pulled low, obscuring the stranger's face, and a cold draft followed him, as if the night itself had entered with him. The man didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out an old, battered mobile phone. He placed it on the counter with deliberate slowness. The device was ancient, the kind Lucas hadn't seen in years. The screen was shattered, the casing dented, and it emitted a faint, almost imperceptible static. Lucas cleared his throat. What's the issue with it?" The man's voice was low, gravelly, and devoid of emotion. "Fix it." Lucas hesitated, his fingers hovering over the phone. Something about the man unsettled him deeply. The way he stood so still, the shadows clinging to him like a second skin. "This is a really old model. I'm not sure I have the parts for it." "Fix it," the man repeated, his tone cold and unwavering. Lucas swallowed hard and picked up the phone. The moment his fingers touched it, a shiver ran down his spine. The phone was unnaturally warm, almost alive. He turned it over, examining the damage. "Where did you get this?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. The man tilted his head slightly. "It's been with me for a long time." There was something in the way he said it, an unsettling finality that made Lucas's chest tighten. He forced himself to focus on the phone, prying off the back cover. What he saw made his stomach drop. The internal components were unlike anything he'd ever seen. The circuitry was chaotic, an impossible web of wires and fragments. At the center was a small, pulsing light, faint but steady, like a heartbeat. This isn't normal," Lucas stammered. "What is this thing?" The man leaned in slightly, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the counter. "Just fix it." Lucas nodded, his hands trembling as he reached for his tools. He tried to focus, but the room felt heavier with each passing second. The static from the phone grew louder, filling the air with an oppressive hum. "Are you sure this thing even works?" Lucas asked, his voice strained. "It works," the man said, his tone chillingly matter-of-fact. Lucas adjusted the cracked screen, soldered a few loose connections, and suddenly, the static stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with tension. Then, the phone rang. Lucas flinched, nearly dropping it. The screen lit up, displaying a string of zeros. It's ringing," he said, glancing nervously at the man. The man didn't move. "Do you want me to answer it?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A slow, deliberate nod. Lucas hesitated, his heart pounding. With a trembling finger, he pressed the answer button. "Hello?" he whispered. At first there was nothing but static. Then, a voice. A distorted, otherworldly voice spoke his name. "Lucas." His blood ran cold. Who is this?" The voice ignored his question, speaking again in a tone that seemed to echo from another realm. "You shouldn't have touched it." The line went dead. The screen dimmed. Lucas stared at the phone, his breath shallow. "What the hell is this thing?" he demanded, looking up at the man. The man didn't answer. He stood there, motionless, his presence suffocating. The phone began to vibrate violently, the screen flashing erratically. The lights in the shop flickered, and the shadows on the walls twisted and writhed like living things. "Take it!" Lucas shouted, panic rising in his chest. "Take it and leave!" The man finally moved, reaching for the phone. The moment his hand touched it, the vibrations stopped. The shadows stilled. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, but Lucas's heart continued to race. The man turned to leave, his footsteps eerily silent. Just as he reached the door, he paused and said in a low, almost guttural voice, "It's not over." The door creaked shut behind him, the bell jingling faintly. Lucas exhaled shakily, relief flooding him, until he saw it. The phone was still on the counter. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "No, no, no." He grabbed the phone and rushed outside, but the street was empty. The man was gone, swallowed by the fog. The phone buzzed in his hand. He looked down to see a text message. "You're part of it now." Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. The phone rang again, the screen showing the same string of zeros. Against every instinct screaming at him to stop, he answered. "Lucas," the distorted voice whispered, "we're watching." The line went dead. Lucas dropped the phone, but it didn't break. It lay there, unscathed, the screen glowing faintly. An image appeared, a photo of his shop taken from outside. He spun around, his eyes scanning the foggy street, but it was empty. When he looked back at the phone, the image had changed. It now showed him standing in the doorway, his face pale with fear. The phone buzzed again, displaying another message. "Look." Lucas hesitated, then slowly turned. His blood turned to ice. Hooded figures stood just beyond the glass, their faces hidden, their forms unnaturally still. They didn't move, but their presence pressed against him, filling the air with dread. The phone buzzed one last time. The screen displayed a countdown. 0010, 009, 008. Lucas's breath hitched. He stumbled back, his eyes darting between the figures and the timer. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. The countdown reached 0. The lights in the shop went out, and Lucas's scream was swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, the shop was silent. The door was locked, the lights off. On the counter sat an old phone, its screen dim, waiting. This is Most Disturbing Mobile Shop Horror Story number 2. It was a night like any other. William sat alone in his dimly lit mobile repair shop, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly. The rain outside was relentless, slapping against the window with an urgency that mirrored the growing unease in his chest. The neon open sign flickered erratically, its glow casting jittery shadows across the counter. He didn't mind the solitude. In fact, he preferred it. The quiet allowed him to focus, to tinker with the phones that customers dropped off daily. It was his routine, his sanctuary. But that night, something felt off. As the clock neared midnight, William finished organizing his tools, wiping down the counter with deliberate care. He reached for the closed sign, ready to call it a night, when a sound pierced the stillness. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was sharp, deliberate. It cut through the rhythm of the rain, demanding his attention. William froze. His hand hovered over the sign as his eyes darted toward the door. Through the rain-smeared glass, the street outside appeared empty. "Who's out there this late?" he murmured, his voice trembling just enough to betray his nerves. The knock came again, louder, more urgent. Knock, knock, knock. William's heart began to race. He took a cautious step toward the door, peering through the glass. The streetlights barely illuminated the sidewalk, the rain creating a veil of distortion. No one was there. Swallowing hard, he unlocked the door and opened it, the cold night air biting at his skin. He leaned out, scanning the street. Nothing. The rain continued its relentless assault, but there was no sign of anyone. He hesitated, glancing back inside before quickly shutting the door and locking it again. "Probably kids messing around," he muttered, though his voice wavered. He turned back toward the counter and stopped. There, on the counter, sat a phone he hadn't seen before. It wasn't one of the devices left by a customer. William would have remembered it. Its sleek, modern design was striking, its screen glowing faintly with static. His breath caught in his throat. His feet felt rooted to the floor. Slowly he stepped closer, drawn to the device despite every instinct telling him to leave it alone. When he picked it up, the phone's surface was unnaturally cold, like ice. The static on the screen shifted and then an image appeared. It was a live video feed of his shop. William's stomach twisted into a knot. The screen showed him standing there, holding the phone, his expression frozen in fear. But there was something else. In the corner of the shop, just barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure. Number no, no, no. He whipped around, his eyes locking onto the corner where the figure should have been. Nothing. The shop was empty. When he looked back at the phone, the figure was gone. Then, the phone buzzed in his hand, sending a jolt through his body. A message appeared on the screen. "Don't turn around." William's breath hitched, his pulse thundered in his ears. He froze, his body trembling as dread seeped into his very bones. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, each more terrifying than the last. He had to turn around. He had to know. Slowly, shakily, he pivoted. Nothing. The shop was just as it had been moments before, silent, still. He exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over him, until the phone buzzed again. Another message. Too late. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. William's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for the flashlight beneath the counter. When the lights stabilized, the door to the back room was open, wide open. William stared at the doorway, his mind screaming at him to run. But he couldn't move. He was frozen, his legs rooted to the floor. From the back room came a sound, a low, dragging noise. William swallowed hard. Gathering what little courage he had, he grabbed the flashlight and inched toward the open door. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating rows of shelves lined with old phone parts and tools. The sound grew louder, closer. It led him to the supply closet, its door slightly ajar. A faint glow seeped through the crack. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. With a deep breath, he yanked the door open. Inside, sitting on the top shelf, was an old rotary phone. It gleamed unnaturally in the light, its surface pristine, untouched by time. And then, it began to ring. The sharp, shrill sound sent shivers down his spine. William stared at it, his breathing shallow. He just knew, that answering it would be a mistake. But he couldn't stop himself. His hand moved as if on its own, lifting the receiver to his ear. The line crackled with static before a voice, low, distorted, and filled with malice, whispered, "You can't leave, William. The loop must continue." His knees buckled and he staggered back, dropping the receiver. The phone's glow intensified, blinding him. When he opened his eyes, he was back at the counter. The tools were neatly arranged. The clock read 11:53 p.m. The rain tapped rhythmically against the window. It was as if time had reset itself. Then came the knock. 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 William's heart sank. He turned slowly toward the door, his hands trembling. The sound was identical to before, deliberate and menacing. The door creaked open on its own. A hooded figure stood in the doorway, their face obscured by darkness. They stepped inside without a word, placing the sleek phone on the counter before retreating into the storm. The clock ticked backward. The phone buzzed, and a message appeared. It begins again. William let out a strangled scream as the shop faded into darkness, the loop resetting once more. The cycle was endless, and there was no escape. This is Most Scary Mobile Shop Horror Story number 3. It was well past 10:30 p.m. when Elliot let out a tired sigh, his shoulders heavy from the long hours spent in his small, dimly lit mobile repair shop. The clock ticked away, marking the moments in a room where time seemed to slow, as if waiting for something. The only sound was the hum of fluorescent lights above and the faint buzz of his phone. He ran his fingers through his hair, exhausted from another lonely night. The shop had been quiet all evening, and he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Something just felt off. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was probably just the late hour getting to him. But then, without warning, the bell above the door jingled. Elliot froze. It was the kind of sound that broke the stillness of the shop, a sound that seemed far too loud in the quiet of the night. He straightened up, his heart thudding in his chest, nerves tingling as the door creaked open. The air shifted. A cold draft swept through the room, brushing against his skin. A figure stood in the doorway. The person was cloaked in shadows, their face obscured by the deep hood of their dark trench coat. Elliot couldn't make out any features, just the figure's silhouette, the outline of a person who looked more like a shadow than a human being. "Can I help you?" Elliot's voice was quieter than he intended, almost a whisper. The words hung in the air, shaky with apprehension. The figure didn't respond at first. They just stood there, unmoving, as if considering whether or not to answer. A chill ran through Elliot. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this felt right. Then, with deliberate slowness, the figure reached into their coat pocket and pulled out a phone. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The phone was an old model, an ancient relic, one of those flip phones that had long since been outdated. He stared at it, confused. Why bring that in for repair? The figure placed the phone on the counter and spoke, their voice low and rasping, as if it came from the depths of a hollow space. "It's broken," they said. Elliot nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Okay, let me take a look." He reached for the phone. As soon as his fingers brushed against the cool surface of the device, an unsettling feeling prickled the back of his neck. There was something about the phone. Something wrong. But he pushed it aside, trying to focus on the task at hand. The phone flickered to life. The screen lit up, but it wasn't showing the usual startup screen. Instead, a message appeared in bright green text. "Welcome back, Elliot." His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't even turned the phone on yet somehow it knew his name. The words felt personal. They hit him in a way he couldn't explain, sending a ripple of panic through him. He looked up quickly, his eyes searching the dimly lit shop. But the figure was gone. The bell above the door jingled again, a soft, haunting sound that sent a shiver down his spine. The door had closed, but there was no one in sight. "Hello," Elliot called out, his voice strained. There was no response. The shop was silent, too silent. He turned back to the phone, a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had to check it. He couldn't leave it alone. When he opened the phone's menu, his breath caught in his throat once more. A folder appeared on the screen, labeled in simple, bold letters, "Do not open." A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He wanted to ignore it, to pretend this was just a mistake, some weird malfunction. But curiosity gnawed at him, pulling him toward the folder. He tapped the screen to open it. Inside were photos. The first one was of the front of his shop, taken at some point earlier in the evening. It looked just as it should, nothing out of place. But the second photo was of him, sitting at the counter, working on a phone just like the one in front of him. He hadn't even realized someone had taken the picture. He shuddered, his mind racing. Who took this? And then the third photo. It was him again, but this time he was looking up, as though sensing someone in the shop with him. His eyes were wide, full of unease, just like they felt in that moment. But it wasn't the photos that paralyzed him with fear. It was the last one. The last photo was of the corner of the shop, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, pooling together in a dark mass. The shadow seemed too dark, too solid, as if it were alive. And right there, at the edge of the shadow, was something that looked like a figure that was barely visible in the darkness. Elliot's pulse quickened. He felt trapped. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed from behind him. A metal shelf clattered to the floor, its tools spilling out in a cacophony of clanging sounds. Elliot jumped, his heart racing. He spun around, eyes wide, expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the room with him. But the shop was empty. The tools, scattered on the floor, were the only evidence of the disturbance. "Who's there?" His voice shook as he spoke, his breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no answer. The shadows in the corners of the shop seemed to lengthen, creeping toward him, closing in like an invisible force. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Elliot's breath formed mist in front of him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. And then a whisper. "Elliot." The voice was soft, barely more than a breath. It came from the darkest corner of the room, just out of sight. He couldn't make out any words, just the tone, hushed, menacing. His legs felt like lead. He wanted to run, to scream, but he couldn't move. He was frozen in place, his eyes wide, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing there. The phone on the counter buzzed again. Elliot didn't want to look at it. He didn't want to touch it. But his hands moved on their own, picking it up as though some force was guiding him. He held it up to his ear, his heart racing in his chest. The line was static at first, the crackling noise filling his ears. Then, faintly, he heard a voice that sounded like it was coming from far away. "Elliot, please." It was a cry for help, distorted, weak, but unmistakable. He pressed the phone closer to his ear, his eyes darting around the shop. The walls seemed to close in. The shadows in the corners were darker, moving, shifting. The whispering continued, louder now, swirling around him. "Elliot, you have to help me." It was the same voice from before, the one he didn't recognize, the one that made his skin crawl. "Who are you?" Elliot's voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling with fear. The voice didn't answer. But just then, a loud bang echoed through the shop. The door to the supply closet slammed open, tools spilling out onto the floor, rolling across the wooden surface. Elliot jumped back, his heart racing as the temperature in the room dropped even further. The phone buzzed again. Elliot glanced at the screen, his hands trembling. It was another message. "It's inside, Elliot. It's always been inside." The words burned into his mind, each letter searing into his thoughts. His pulse was deafening in his ears now. He felt like the shadows were pressing in on him, suffocating him. There was something here, something dark, something ancient. The phone vibrated again, a final chilling message appearing on the screen. "Face it, or you'll never leave." The room grew colder. The air felt thick, suffocating, like a weight was pressing down on his chest. And then he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate behind him, heavy like the sound of boots dragging across the floor. Elliot's heart hammered in his chest. He turned around, expecting to see the shadow, the figure, but the shop was empty, except for the phone. It lay on the counter, glowing eerily in the dark. The screen flickered again, one final message. "Run." He didn't hesitate. His body moved before his mind could even process it. He bolted for the door, hands gripping the handle, pulling with all his strength. But the door wouldn't open. He turned and ran for the back room, trying the door there, but it too was stuck. Something was closing in. The shadows had taken form, and they were reaching for him. "Help!" Elliot screamed. "Please!" But the only response was the low hum of the phone, the message on the screen, and then the whisper, closer now, right in his ear. "You can't escape." In the dead silence that followed, Elliot knew it was true. He wasn't getting out. The phone, this place, was never going to let him go.